Hello, everybody. I'm James Kilsby, Chief Analyst with Vixio Regulatory Intelligence, and we're very proud to be partnering with SBC today as part of the Player Protection Day. If you are not familiar with Vixio, we are a regulatory intelligence and intelligence platform that provides a full suite of tools and intelligence for the global gaming and payments industries. As part of our services, we monitor and analyze regulatory and compliance developments on a global scale, and have a range of reports and solutions that allow our users to review and compare responsible gaming, advertising, and various other regulatory requirements in markets across the world, both land-based and online. Earlier this month, we published our Player Protection Outlook, in which a team of Vixio analysts offered some trends and observations on recent developments and pending policy discussions related to player protection and responsible gambling. As part of your participation in today's event, you'll learn more about that report, but please also visit vixio.com to learn more about how we help the industry and various stakeholders around the gambling landscape to better digest and understand compliance obligations and key policy discussions in this fundamentally important area. The purpose of today's session will be for Vixio to highlight just 4 important but by no means exclusive areas of current policy discussion when it comes to player protection and responsible gambling. You can see them there on your screen. We believe that each of these 4 areas have been important, and they have been evolving in important ways in 2024. And we're absolutely confident that they will carry over and discussions will continue to evolve in 2025 and beyond. To present this to you today, I will be joined by my colleague, Joe Ewens, who is Vixio Gambling Compliance's managing editor in London. And I think that, Joe, you're going to kick us off with some observations around affordability.
I am indeed. Thank you, James. Yes, as you will have seen on our little preview slide there, we think affordability is very much a matter of when, not if, for a lot of markets globally. The concept, as I'm sure you probably know, is that operators should be able to assess whether or not their customers are gambling with money that they can afford to lose, or whether they're spending more than they ought to and getting themselves into issues with gambling harm. It's fair to say that the debate probably started on this in the UK, and it's been the dominant issue in the gambling regulation conversation in the UK for several years now. But it was only in August of this year that a light touch version of the policy was launched that just sees operators required to check databases for things like whether a customer has any bankruptcy judgments against them, or if they've defaulted on loans. However, the more comprehensive and, it's fair to say, controversial version of this policy is currently in a pilot called financial risk assessments, and it includes more than just an affordability check, but looking into a gambler's spending power makes up a really core component of that. But the UK is not the only market where affordability is already being seen in practice. From this autumn, operators in the Netherlands have also had to perform affordability checks. That is linked to a system of deposit limits. So regulations that came in set up new deposit limits, 700 euros per month or 300 euros if you are between 18 and 25. But under that system, limits can be raised if a customer can prove to a gambling operator that they are able to afford that. The method in which they do that is not strictly defined in what will be familiar to many people. It's more outcomes-based regulation than it is a strict set of rules to follow. But we will see in the coming months whether the Dutch gambling regulator feels the need to issue guidance, or whether there's any enforcement around operators who are not adhering to that policy properly. But these are 2 examples of affordability as it exists now. But we certainly see that there will at least be conversations around adopting affordability in lots of other jurisdictions. In many ways, it's the natural next step to deposit limits, which have become quite common, particularly in Western European markets. From an operator's standpoint, you can see that affordability is clearly a preferable option. It enables gamblers to potentially go past these higher deposit limits if you can be confident that they can afford it without getting into trouble. But it's also fair to say that the concept of affordability has proved to be pretty controversial, not just with customers who some of them don't like the idea of gambling operators potentially being able to look into their personal finances, but also on a political front. In some jurisdictions, it's crossed a kind of political ethical boundary around privacy and the right for people to spend their money as they wish. While we see the concept growing, even in the markets where it's already been adopted, it's certain to remain a politically charged area of gambling regulation. And we're seeing evidence, in fact, of this growing conversation globally. James, maybe you could talk us through the discussions, at least, that are happening in the US.
Yeah, that's right, Joe. I think absolutely there's interest among policymakers in the concept of protecting gamblers from spending beyond their means, and the affordability construct is something that's being discussed, different guises, as you say, and spreading certainly beyond the kind of European core of the regulated online gambling industry to across the Atlantic. This has been a policy discussion in Brazil. It has not, we'll come to this, but hasn't implemented a affordability framework, at least not yet. And what we saw in September here in the US, in Washington, where I'm based, a US senator and a US congressman both introduced bills in the two chambers of Congress to establish a federal framework for online sports betting that includes explicit affordability checks and will require all states to adopt regulations to ensure that any player that deposited more than $1,000 in a day or $10,000 over the course of a month would have to undertake and pass an affordability check that is comparable to how you might similarly satisfy an affordability check on a bank loan, or could demonstrate that the amount you're depositing was not more than 30% of your monthly income. I don't think there is anyone in the industry who really anticipates that the so-called Safe Bet Act will be approved by Congress or signed into law anytime in the near future. But having said that, it's evidence of this global conversation around the concept of affordability spreading to the North American market, and I do believe that US state regulators are interested in the subject and learning more about it and thinking about sort of other options there outside of a federal mandate. So we'll see how that evolves in 2025 and beyond.
And probably the most compelling market at the moment, Brazil. There's also talk of affordability in that conversation as well.
Yes, yeah. The Brazilian regulator indicated that operators may be obliged to evaluate the income of their gamblers as part of onboarding. That is not part of the regulations. We'll come on imminently to what is, but there is there's certainly concern among Brazilian policymakers around affordability in the broadest possible sense of the idea of the perceived risks of poorer players spending beyond their means on gambling. So again, yeah, I think that certainly can be another area that evolves and a key market to watch.
Thank you. I'll hand over to you, James, to take us through the concept of monitoring.
That's right. Yeah. So the next key area we wanted to flag was monitoring and intervention. Again, I don't think this is a new concept by any stretch of the imagination. Similar to affordability, something that has been discussed and debated over the course of a number of years. We have already seen both sort of third-party providers and operators themselves develop and implement monitoring systems that enable operators to evaluate the behaviors of their players and have the ability then to intervene and with different types of responses based on the different behavioral triggers that are there. So yes, this is not new. It's been a obligation, at least in the UK and several other European markets for several years. But I do think what we are seeing as part of a trend is that this is becoming a more common. It's more common for regulations to directly mandate monitoring and intervention and the implementation of those systems. That's what we're seeing is what had been a practice that had evolved, and then an expectation is now being codified. A few examples of that, and again, this is another example of some of the things that have started in Europe spreading beyond. You can see on the screen there. It is a requirement to implement such systems in Ontario. New Jersey has adopted best practices that really function as regulations to similarly oblige operators to have monitoring and intervention systems. A handful of other US states, including Colorado, have followed suit. Similarly, this is an area that is a key plank of Brazil's new regulatory regime. We just mentioned how Brazil has not implemented an affordability requirement yet, but there is a central part of responsible gaming requirements in Brazil is for the newly licensed operators to analyze their player profiles, establish specific risk profiles, and then implement monitoring systems that will enable them to flag changes in behavior and intervene. So I think this is what we're seeing is this is becoming the norm in newly regulated markets, and very much part of the body of regulations of more markets. I think one thing that will be interesting to watch going forward is to what extent do the different triggers and the different thresholds at which those triggers might be met, do they start to become specified by regulators rather than like in Brazil and other markets, and such as Ontario, operators design their own system and conduct their own risk analysis and do that accordingly. Again, you mentioned outcomes-based regulation versus something that is specified. New Jersey does have specific triggers recommended at specific levels. Other markets do not. So I think the extent to which we see more specifics that come from the regulator and how those specific thresholds or triggers may differ jurisdiction to jurisdiction, that seems to be a question for the future. I guess I think the intertwining of these areas is kind of inevitable, really, affordability and monitoring, and we'll kind of keep on that basis. We'll pass over to you, Joe, for your thoughts around the concept of a single customer view.
Sure, yeah. So single customer view, as you say, very much links into these other areas we've already been talking about, but essentially describes any kind of system where operators are sharing customer data between each other in order to prevent those at risk of gambling harm from disguising their issue by hopping from operator to operator, whether deliberately or without themselves knowing. So the UK Commission was probably at the forefront of this, at least in terms of the term. They brought the term over from the financial sector where it's sort of pre-existing, but definitely wasn't the first major market really to implement this kind of system. Those familiar with Germany will know the acronym LUGAS, which is a central database that was mandated by the long debated interstate treaty, and that's a system run by the regulator that all operators need to be connected to. All their platforms have to connect into this, and it implements various different controls, but fundamentally what it does is operates a cross-operator deposit limit, prevents players from opening more than one licensed gambling operator at once, and affords the industry a certain amount of oversight of its players and their gambling habits. This is a pretty on the kind of relative scale of complexity of single customer view solutions. This is towards the top end. It's a pretty complex IT system, and it's certainly not been without its issues. The German industry has complained of various downtimes for LUGAS, which create, if not always technical headaches, definitely compliance headaches. Are you really allowed to take to take bets from players if you can't link into the system, which you're supposed to do for monitoring? So it's not without its complications, but that is a system that's in place. By contrast, the UK does not have a system currently up and running, but it is trialing one under the moniker GAM Protect. Under that system, in contrast to the German one, the industry will set up its own system under the supervision of the Gambling Commission, but that will see operators sharing customer data so that they can identify when people are getting into trouble, and only the data around customers who are perceived to be at risk will be shared. So if a customer has been flagged, at least under the current version of the pilot, it's very much a pilot and subject to change. Also of note that only 6 operators of the several hundred in the UK market are currently taking part, which is something that the Commission has warned it may act on, that might become more mandatory to take part in this pilot if more people don't step up. And then in the long term, this is going to become a kind of core part of UK gambling licensing. And I would say, much like affordability, when we look at this, we see you've got a couple of markets with this sort of system up and running. We strongly suggest that other jurisdictions are going to look at this as well. I know that the Netherlands individuals from the Dutch government have expressed interest in looking at this. It does raise certain concerns outside of those we've already spoken about, particularly around data protection, and is something that's very sensitive and protected by law. In the UK, the Gambling Commission had got a sign off from the Information Commissioner's Office. But anytime these systems are rolled out in any jurisdiction, that there will be privacy rules that need to be looked at. It's also fair to say a cybersecurity concern creates another point of entry where customer data is being stored, and potentially quite a lucrative one if it's collecting a lot of information together, like Lugas is. But yes, it's something that's up and running in several jurisdictions. Spain as well, it's worth noting, also set to test its own version in the near future, linked to deposit limits, much like the German system and like the Dutch affordability rules that we spoke about earlier. So yes, very much a growing issue, and we'll be watching the existing and kind of coming online systems in 2025 to see how they evolve. But I think that's enough on the single customer view for the moment. James, let me throw it back to you to talk about advertising.
Certainly. Obviously, advertising and marketing is a somewhat, to some degree, tangential area compared to player protection, responsible gaming, but also intertwined, because it's fair to say that, generally speaking, regulatory limits around advertising and marketing, primarily driven by player protection, public policy concerns. So again, this is an area that's been in sharp focus for a number of years, and I'm sure everyone knows debates and restrictions that have been imposed in European countries from Italy and Spain that continued in recent years through Netherlands, Belgium, this year Bulgaria, following suit with very restrictive advertising limits. We believe that absolutely will continue. Not seeing any slowdown around debate when it comes to limiting of advertising, and Australia is emerging as very much a bellwether for where this goes in the future. A major gambling market, very large online sports betting market, and the Australian House of Representatives has recommended that all sponsorship and advertising of sports betting is phased out, and the federal government in Australia is running out of time really to respond to that and make a firm policy recommendation for to what extent it wants to follow those restrictions and how Australia is going to limit advertising. Advertising remains in sharp focus. Another area that we've seen an increasing Discussion is around to what extent and how governments or regulators should restrict bonuses and other incentives that can be offered by operators to their players. There's various different approaches that have been applied here, but what does appear to be quite an interesting trend is that if we think about new markets, big new markets that are just passing legislation or implementing regulations for online gambling, they seem to be trending towards restricting or banning acquisition bonuses, so welcome offers and bonuses that are offered as incentives for new players, yet still allowing at least some kind of loyalty retention bonuses to existing players. Brazil, Finland, two examples of that. So yeah, I think we think bonuses and how they are treated equally remain in focus going forward. But the one other area that we wanted to flag as a area to watch when it comes to advertising and marketing policy is how can or should gambling regulators address the role of social media influencers, content creators, streamers, etc., when it comes to a promotional channel for online gambling. We spoke about advertising restrictions. Often the sort of template that is followed is to restrict where ads can be broadcast and at what hours of the day they can be broadcast. There's some applicability to social media and influencers, but it's not like for like, and it's an entirely different ecosystem of platforms and media platforms that are involved when it comes to influencers as opposed to traditional broadcast advertising. So I think that will be an area that is in focus, and we've spoken about Brazil, but I do think Brazil is a case study on to watch when it comes to influencers. The Brazilian unregulated offshore market has exploded in size over recent years, and a meaningful driver of that growth, not the only factor by any stretch, but still significant, has been social media influencers promoting offshore sites in ways that would not fit within the four corners of any jurisdiction's responsible gambling regulations, including Brazil's pending rules that will be coming into effect soon. So a Brazilian regulator has taken steps here to oblige operators to have formal contracts with influencers and other types of affiliates that promote their platforms, that include a requirement for those partners to be trained on responsible gambling and to abide by advertising, marketing, and other rules. And we will see. I think it's a good case study as to how is it possible for to what extent can regulators influence the behaviour via operators of influencers that promote them in a market that has really played a very significant role in the growth of an unregulated jurisdiction. So Brazil will be an interesting case study there, and I do think that regulators from European, North American, various markets will be thinking about this area and what's the most appropriate ways of setting new policies, if new policies are needed, when it comes to advertising and marketing, because it's now such a key driver of consumer behavior, but not just in online gambling, but generally. And it wasn't when regulators and policymakers first started talking about this issue 10-ish years ago. Just didn't exist. I think that's all we have time for today. So we just want to highlight these four areas that may provide some backdrop in terms of policy discussions to the other sessions that are being discussed as part of the SPC Player Protection Day. Again, Vixio is very proud to partner with SPC on the Player Protection Day. And if you'd like to learn more about Vixio, please do email us at the email address you see on the screen there, or visit vixio.com. you.